The news traveled faster than the sirens, and in the underworld of this city, news is the only currency that never devalues. Before the first gray light of dawn touched the skyscrapers, every shadow dweller, every corrupt official, and every rival kingpin knew the same thing. The man who had shaped the city's darkness for 20 years, a man most referred to only as the architect, had been pulled from a mangled cage of steel and glass. The ambush had been a masterpiece of violence. It wasn't a warning, it was a period at the end of a very long sentence. Yet, as the surgeons worked under the harsh, unforgiving lights of the ICU, a secondary rumor began to circulate, one even more unsettling than the crash itself. He had not died, not when the fuel tank ignited, not when his heart stopped for 4 minutes in the ambulance, not when the lead was pulled from his chest. That survival unsettled the city. It meant the power vacuum wasn't quite empty. It meant there was still a ghost in the machine. Inside the intensive care unit, the machines spoke in measured, rhythmic tones, a cold language of pings and hums that were the only things keeping the architect anchored to the earth. Tubes traced quiet, clinical paths across his body. His face, once the stern image of absolute authority, was now a map of trauma, swollen, pale, and marked by deep lacerations that still held the grit of the asphalt. His eyes remained closed, his hands motionless, but his pulse, stubbornly recorded on the glowing monitor, refused to flatline. Outside the heavy double doors, the atmosphere was different. The men who had once stood at his back, waiting for a single nod to start a war, now stood apart from one another. They were careful with their posture. They were even more cautious with their words. They checked their phones with an obsessive frequency, looking for a sign of where the wind was blowing. No one stayed longer than protocol demanded. In the silence of the hospital hallway, the assumption had already solidified. If he lived, he would be a vegetable. If he died, the city would be divided like a carcass among wolves. Then his wife arrived. Sloane did not rush. She didn't arrive with the frantic energy of a grieving spouse. She entered the hospital at mid-morning, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that cost more than the nurses' yearly salaries. Her expression was a masterclass in composed tragedy, just enough sadness to be respectable, but enough steel to show she was in control. She didn't ask questions at the desk, she already had the floor cleared. When she reached the glass wall of his room, she didn't go inside. She didn't touch the glass. She simply stood there, looking at the broken man who had given her everything, and then she nodded. It wasn't a nod of relief. It was the nod of a person checking a task off a list. Within hours, the directive was issued through the organization's hidden channels. Sloane was stepping back from the emotional burden of his care. She made it clear that medical decisions would be left to the professionals. In the coded language of the mafia, she was signaling that the architect was already dead to her. She began the process of probate while his heart was still beating. She moved his accounts. She changed the security codes. She spoke of his inevitable passing with a practiced, hollow sigh. But she had forgotten one thing. In the grand house they shared, there was a woman who had been part of the furniture for 15 years, Elena, the maid. Elena had been in the hospital before the sirens stopped. She was a woman of indeterminate age, with a face that had learned the art of being invisible. In the architect's household, she existed at the margins. She cleaned the blood off the marble floors after difficult meetings. She served coffee during late-night strategy sessions and left the room before the first secret was uttered. No one knew her last name. No one knew where she slept. But she was the only one who saw the architect not as a king or a monster, but as a man who had once saved her daughter's life when the world had turned its back on them. When the high-priced security team told Elena to go home, she didn't argue. She just didn't move. She stood near the bed, her movements economical and quiet. She straightened a blanket that didn't need it. She wiped a surface that was already sterile. Her eyes never left the monitor. When a hospital supervisor threatened to call security, Elena simply looked up, and for the first time in 15 years, people saw the iron in her soul. She didn't say a word, but she didn't leave. Eventually, the staff, overwhelmed by the political chaos of the architect's empire, simply gave up and let the old woman stay. The first week was a slow descent into a cold reality. Outside the hospital, the city was adjusting. The architect's rivals began testing the fences, reclaiming territory he had held for decades. Sloane was seen at high-end restaurants with men who had previously been her husband's enemies. She was selling the empire piece by piece, ensuring her own future while leaving his legacy to rot. She stopped visiting the hospital entirely by day 4. She told the press she was grieving in private. Inside the room, the silence was absolute, save for the machines. But the architect was not as gone as they thought. Consciousness didn't return all at once. It came in jagged shards. The smell of antiseptic, the weight of his own limbs feeling like lead weights, the sound of a woman's soft breathing. He couldn't open his eyes yet, the light felt like needles, but he could hear, and what he heard was the sound of his world being dismantled. He heard the doctors whispering about quality of life and pulling the plug. He heard the nurses talking about his wife's new business partner. But most of all, he felt Elena. He felt the cool cloth on his forehead. He felt the way she turned him every 2 hours to prevent sores, doing the work the nurses neglected because they thought he was a corpse. He felt her hand on his wrist, not checking a pulse, but just holding on. It was the only tether he had. On the 10th day, the first real threat arrived, not from an assassin, but from a lawyer. Sloane had sent a representative to review the medical necessity of long-term life support. They were looking for a way to legally end him. The lawyer stood at the foot of the bed, talking to a doctor about dignity and finality. Elena stood in the corner, a tray of water in her hands, her head bowed. The lawyer glanced at her as if she were a piece of equipment. "The wife wants a timeline," the lawyer said. "She needs to know when we can transition to palliative care." "He's stable," the doctor replied, his voice wavering. "But the brain activity it's a gray area." The architect, lying there in the dark of his own mind, felt a surge of cold fury. He tried to move a finger. Nothing. He tried to scream. Silence. He was a prisoner in a failing tower. Then he felt Elena's hand. She had walked over to the bed to adjust the IV. As she did, her thumb pressed firmly against his palm. It was a signal. "I am here. Don't let go." The lawyer left, but the clock was now ticking. Sloane wanted the inheritance, and she wanted it now. She began to orchestrate a mercy campaign. She spoke to the media about the tragedy of a strong man reduced to a shell. She was preparing the public for his death so that when it happened, no one would ask questions. That night, for the first time, Elena spoke. The room was dark, the hallway quiet. She leaned close to his ear, her voice a dry whisper that cut through the hum of the ventilators. "They think you are a ghost, sir, but a ghost can still haunt. Your wife is meeting with the Moretti family tonight. They are signing over the docs. If they take the docs, you have nothing left to come back to." The architect's heart rate spiked on the monitor. A nurse came running in, checking the wires. Elena stepped back into the shadows, the perfect, invisible servant. When the nurse left, Elena returned. "I have the phone," she whispered. "I took it from the lawyer's briefcase while he was talking to the doctor. Tell me the code. Blink once for yes, twice for no." The architect opened his eyes. The light was blinding, a white-hot agony, but he forced them to stay open. He looked at the maid. In her eyes, he didn't see pity, he saw a soldier. For the next week, a silent war was waged in room 412. While the world believed the architect was a vegetable, a new network was being built. Using the stolen phone and Elena as his hands, the architect began to send messages. They weren't long. They were simple codes, phrases only his most loyal captains would recognize. The gargoyle watches the gate. The river flows north in winter. Across the city, 3 men received these messages. They were men Sloane had tried to buy off, men who had been pushed to the fringes of the new regime. When they saw the messages, they didn't go to the police, and they didn't go to Sloane. They went to the hospital. But Sloane was no fool. She noticed the shift in the atmosphere. She saw that her husband's loyalists were suddenly quiet, suddenly missing from her meetings. She realized that the dead man was still casting a shadow. She arrived at the hospital on day 15, not with a lawyer, but with 2 of her own security men. She didn't go to the glass. She walked straight into the room. Elena was there, as always, cleaning the window. "Out," Sloane said, her voice like cracking ice. Elena didn't move. "I have orders to stay with the patient, ma'am." "My orders are the only ones that matter." Sloane stepped toward the bed. She looked down at her husband. His eyes were closed. He looked pathetic. "You were always so meticulous. You planned everything, but you didn't plan for me. I'm going to finish what that truck started, and by the time they find the equipment failure, I'll be halfway to Zurich." She began to tighten her grip on the tube. The heart monitor began to beep, slowly at first, then faster. "Goodbye, Arthur," she said. Suddenly, a hand, cold, thin, and shaking with a primal effort, clamped around Sloane's wrist. Sloane gasped, her eyes widening. She tried to pull away, but the grip was like a steel trap. The architect's eyes snapped open. They weren't the eyes of a dying man. They were the eyes of the man who had burned half the city to build his throne. He didn't speak. He couldn't, but he didn't have to. The door to the room swung open. The 2 security men Sloane had brought weren't there. In their place stood the 3 captains who had received the architect's messages. Behind them stood Elena, her face calm, her apron slightly wrinkled from the scuffle. "The architect has regained consciousness, ma'am," Elena said softly. "Should I call the doctors, or should I call the police to report an attempted murder?" Sloane's face went white. She looked at the captains. They weren't looking at her with respect or fear. They were looking at her like a problem that had just been solved.
"The accounts have been frozen, Sloane," one of the captains said. "The Moretti deal is off, and the men don't like it when someone tries to kill the boss in his sleep. It's bad for morale." The next hour was a blur of motion. The hospital staff was pushed aside as the architect's private medical team arrived, vetted and loyal. Sloane was escorted out, not to a jail, but to a waiting car. In that world, the police were a mercy she wouldn't be granted. She was taken to the very house she had tried to steal, to wait for her husband's final judgment. The recovery was not a miracle. It was a long, brutal climb. The architect had to relearn how to walk, how to speak, how to hold a pen, but he did it with a ferocity that terrified his doctors. Every time he wanted to give up, every time the pain in his shattered ribs became too much, he would look at the corner of the room. Elena was always there. She didn't ask for a promotion. She didn't ask for money. She just went back to the house and began cleaning. She scrubbed the floors, she polished the silver, and she prepared the master bedroom for his return. 1 month later, the architect returned home. He walked through the front doors with a cane, his limp pronounced, his face scarred, but his presence heavier than it had ever been. The house was quiet. The friends and associates who had toasted his death were gone. The wife who had betrayed him was elsewhere. He sat in his heavy leather chair in the study. The room smelled of cedar and old books. He looked at the desk where so many lives had been decided. Elena entered with a tray, a single cup of coffee, exactly the way he liked it. She set it down and turned to leave. "Elena," he said. His voice was raspy, a ghost of its former power. She stopped. "Yes, sir?" "Why?" he asked. "Everyone else saw an opportunity. Everyone else saw a way out. You saw a broken man. Why did you stay?" Elena turned to face him. For the first time, she didn't bow her head. 20 years ago, my daughter was sick. You didn't know me. I was just the woman who ironed your shirts. But you heard me crying in the kitchen. You didn't ask questions. You just sent your private doctor to my apartment. You saved her. You forgot about it the next day. I never did. The architect looked at Elena. He realized that in his quest to build an empire of fear, he had accidentally built a single pillar of genuine loyalty, and that pillar had saved him when the empire crumbled. "Sloane is at the villa in the north," he said. "She thinks she is waiting for a settlement. She thinks I am going to be merciful." Elena didn't blink. "And will you be, sir?" The architect picked up the coffee cup. His hand was steady. "I am a man of my word, Elena. I told her I would give her everything she deserved. It's time to settle the books." He took a sip of the coffee. It was perfect. "Call the captains," he said. "The architect is back, and tell them to bring the maid's daughter to the house. She'll be working in the administrative office from now on. We need someone we can trust." Elena bowed, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "Yes, sir." As she walked out of the room, the lights of the city began to flicker on outside the window. The shadows were returning, but this time the man in the chair knew exactly who was standing in them. The city had thought the architect was finished. They had thought the story was over. But as the first car of the convoy pulled into the driveway, it became clear that the real story, the one of debt, blood, and the terrifying price of loyalty, was only just beginning. In the end, it wasn't the guns or the money that won the war. It was the woman with the cleaning cloth, waiting in the corner, watching the world burn, and knowing exactly when to throw the water. The architect leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the dark, because he knew that even in the deepest shadow, there was someone watching over him, and that was the most powerful weapon of all. The return of the architect was not just a restoration, it was a purge. The city, which had begun to feel comfortable in the chaos of his absence, suddenly felt the noose tighten. But as the days turned into weeks, the architect realized that the damage done by Sloane was deeper than just stolen money. She had compromised the very soul of his operation. She had sold secrets to the federal task force. She had traded the locations of the safe houses for a promise of immunity. The architect sat in his study, the map of his influence spread before him. It was a map of holes. "They're coming for us, aren't they?" Elena asked, as she brought in the evening mail. She didn't sound afraid, she sounded practical. "The feds have enough to bury me 3 times over," the architect admitted. "Sloane didn't just want the money, she wanted me to spend the rest of my life in a cage. She knew I'd survive the crash. She wanted to make sure I didn't survive the aftermath." He looked at the maid. "You should go, Elena. Take your daughter and leave the city. I've set up an account for you. It's enough to live anywhere in the world." Elena set the mail down. She didn't even look at the check he had placed on the corner of the desk. "You still don't understand, do you?" "What do you understand?"
"You think loyalty is something you buy," she said. "You think it's a transaction. But I didn't stay because of the doctor you sent 20 years ago. I stayed because you're the only man in this city who actually keeps his word. And in a world of liars, that's worth dying for." The architect looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, the mask of the monster slipped. He looked tired. "Then we have work to do," he said. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in counterintelligence. While the FBI prepared their raids, the architect was busy moving. But he wasn't moving his money, he was moving his past. He realized that the only way to beat Sloane's betrayal was to destroy the evidence she had given them. And that evidence was held in a secure facility in the heart of the judicial district. "I can get in," Elena said during the midnight briefing. The captains laughed. "You? It's a fortress, lady. We'd need a tank." "No," Elena said, her voice steady. "You'd need a ghost. I've been cleaning offices like that for 30 years. I know the shift changes. I know which guards take their breaks at the back entrance. I know how to disappear in plain sight. The architect looked at her. It was madness. It was a suicide mission. Do it, he said. The night of the raid was the longest hour of the architect's life. He sat in the dark of his study, the radio silent, the clock ticking like a heartbeat. Every second that passed was a second Elena was in the mouth of the wolf. Then the radio crackled. "The laundry is done." Elena's voice came through, calm and rhythmic. The architect let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. By dawn, the evidence was ash. The FBI raided empty warehouses. The safe houses were vacant. The witnesses Sloan had coached suddenly had nothing to say. The architect had won, but the victory felt different this time. He stood on the balcony of his house, watching the sun rise over the city he had conquered for the second time. Elena stood behind him, a quiet presence in the doorway. "It's done," he said. "Is it?" she asked. "Sloan is gone. The feds are blind. The empire is secure. And what about you?" The architect turned to look at her. He looked at the scars on his hands, the gray in his hair. He realized that for 20 years he had been building a kingdom of ghosts. "I think," the architect said, "it's time for the architect to retire. The city needs a new builder." He looked at the maid. "I'm leaving the organization to the captains, under one condition. They answer to you." Elena froze. "Me? I'm just a maid." "No," the architect said. "You're the only person who saw me when I was nothing. You're the only one who knows the difference between power and loyalty. You're the one who kept the heart beating when the rest of the body was dead." He walked over to her and handed her a small iron key. It was the key to the vault that held the true secrets of the city. "The architect is dead," he whispered. "Long live the Queen." As he walked down the stairs and out into the morning air, leaving the house and the blood and the shadows behind him, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. Behind him, in the high window of the study, a woman stood watching. She wasn't holding a tray, and she wasn't holding a cleaning cloth. She was holding a key. And for the first time in 20 years, the city felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind, because the shadows had a new master, and she knew every secret they had ever tried to hide. The architect drove away, a free man for the first time in his life, but in the rear-view mirror he could see the silhouette of the house on the hill. It was a house built on marble and blood, but as he watched it fade into the distance, he realized it was finally a home, because it was guarded by the only thing more dangerous than a mafia boss, a woman who had been forgotten, and a woman who would never forget. Would you like me to refine the pacing of any specific chapter or expand on the purge sequence for more tension?